All right, everybody. It's a real joy to have you here. I am delighted to be able to share. Here we've got four topics. First of all, happy birthday to me. I will I gave myself a couple of slides. Second is what is leadership? Third is a chance for you guys to discuss and bring in your own understanding. And then fourth is an exhortation to go forth and lead. So, first of all, happy birthday to me. I'm 49 today. And I think I wanted to share with you probably one of my all-time favorite videos, just as a bit of a summary here. Right. So thank you very much to Xbox for making that video. I do think life is short. I do think we should play more. I don't know that you should spend more of your life on the Xbox, though, although I appreciate the hard work they did to make that video. My status report is I'm about 50% of the way through estimated life expectancy. Checked a few boxes here and have a few boxes still left to check. And so I have been thinking about how to make my life meaningful for a very long time. And I know you're in different ways thinking about how to make your life meaningful as well. And I really feel like leadership is one of the most important, powerful topics for us to understand and deeply internalize to make our life meaningful because we influence others, and I'll talk a lot more about that. And some of you have chosen to biologically reproduce and make more of your genetic selves, but some of us are not necessarily biologically reproducing, but we reproduce our ideas, our visions, our inspiration. All of human creative activity is a way of reproducing, of sharing, of trying to continue to cheat death a little bit. So I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of leadership, and I have the benefit of being an introverted engineer. So I tend to approach all of these things like a technical problem. There's some people for whom leadership comes naturally, and they're just automatically very social creatures. And there's others of us for whom we've got to think a lot about it. And based on the thinking that I've done, I wanted to share some of the insights in case you're in that category as well. A quote that I really like is leadership just means influence. And this is by one of the main writers, thinkers on leadership named John Maxwell. Leadership just means influence. And so I want to start with this question about who or what are we? So if we are being influenced by others, if we are influencing others, we need to figure out who we are, what they are in brief. And so I'm heavily biased by my Buddhist training, but Buddha defined us as a heap of aggregates, like a bunch of stuff. That's basically his definition. We are these five things. We've got a bunch of physical bits, we've got feelings, thoughts and perceptions, and actions, and then within it all, it's consciousness. And so we can think about this as a very simple mental model. If we want a simple mental model of who we are, who others are, we can just think it's these five things: something physical, and then feelings, thoughts, actions, and consciousness, a conscious being. Now, the being that we are is changing continuously, and we're influencing others continuously. And so I've got this picture here. This is a mountain stream, and I want you to look at this a little bit because there's a lot going on, right? You've got the sky and clouds. And from the sky and clouds, you've got rain and snow, and you can see all this snow here. And then as the sun melts the snow, it becomes a river. And you can see this riverbed, right? All of these rocks that have been washed down the mountain and then into this lake. And so you've got this lake, and we can think each of us are like a lake. We have received the genetic material from our parents, grandparents, ancestors. We've received cultural material from our teachers, schools, parents, other friends, influences, media, and so forth. And the flows, the streams that are converging on us are infinite, right? Especially these days. Our grandparents met as many people in their entire life as we meet in a typical week. And that's a week where you're not going to the airport, right? So we are around so many people. Now, when we think about what's actually going on inside of us, we tend to not have particularly great clarity on that. We might have some sort of rose-colored view of what's going on. I think all my actions are altruistic and wise. If I take a more skeptical point of view, probably not quite there. And our view of others as well is pretty murky, right? It's cloudy, and there may be a little bit of a distrust, mistrust skew to things. Obviously, it depends on who they are and so forth. But my collection of aggregates, this collection of bits, this mountain stream, so to speak, and other people, your collections of aggregates, your mountain lakes, I guess we could say a data lake. That's the modern hip term, but we're all influence each other, right? Our actions influence others' feelings, others' actions influence our feelings. We're always bumping into each other. And what's happening is this continuous interplay and circulation of ideas, basically physical and mental characteristics. Now, there's a quote that is extremely deep, extremely profound, that hopefully can inspire a little bit, infuse a little bit of your understanding here. The flow of energy through a system acts to organize that system. So the flow of energy through a system acts to organize the system. And this is from a text on biology from 60 years ago. But this is true of a single cell. This is true of a chemical soup. This is true of organisms. This is true of companies, nations, solar systems. It's a general rule. And so when we think about the flow in physics, roughly speaking, you can divide everything in the universe into two things: energy and information. And you could say matter as well, but matter and energy are interconvertible. Now, I find it very interesting, because I'm a nerd, that data cables and power cables are basically the same thing. It's a bunch of copper and some insulation. And power cables, these things on the bottom are power cables. You can see they're a bit thicker, like a little bit more copper there, because they are conducting not just information, they're conducting power. And these little data cables, they're very thin, right? This is a Cat5 Ethernet cable, very thin, but the way of conducting information through a cable and the way of conducting power through a cable are basically similar. They both take a little bit of energy to send the information. Now, if you're conducting power, you don't need a lot of information. You just 60 hertz power going on. And if you're conducting information, you don't need a lot of power. Information power, a bit of a trade-off. But I want you to think about that analogy when we think about human social interactions. And so there's a book in the DevOps space, Wiring the Winning Organization, very deep. It was a 10-year research project from Gene Kim and Steve Spear, who are two of the biggest thinkers, the two biggest thinkers in DevOps and Lean. They worked together for 10 years. They came to the conclusion that you could understand everything about organizations, corporations, whatever, through the analogy of social circuitry. And the idea of social circuitry is, for example, here, think about the power dynamics here. I have invited you to a webinar. I'm controlling all the buttons. I can kick you out of the webinar. I can mute you. I can unmute you. I'm the only one talking. You're forced to listen to me. You've been on so many webinars. You're like, oh my God, he's just doing slides again. I'm going to die. But you have no choice, because it would be rude if you dropped this call. So I have all the power. And so you think about power in human social interactions. Right now, I am the big, powerful alpha gorilla on this Zoom call, and you are not, right? But so we want to think about not just the social circuitry, what is the direction of flow? So in this context, the information, I'm the only one talking. All the information is flowing from me to you. And so it's like a stream, right, where the water uphill is flowing downhill. The information that I have is flowing down to you. So that's a directional flow. Now, in a little bit, we'll go into breakout groups and you guys can flow together and whoever wants to talk can talk and we'll make this a much more fair, democratic, equitable event. But right now I'm demonstrating power. What I'm demonstrating is what's called dominance and submission. And so dominance and submission has two definitions. One, it's a type of X-rated cosplay, not to be confused with furries. Now, this slide, had I done this in any of my previous jobs, I'm sure I would be fired, but this is an independent webinar. There's nobody who can fire me. This may be a terrible idea to introduce this analogy, but I want you to also understand that this is the basis for organization in social species. So every social species does have some kind of power hierarchies that guide remember this quote, the flow of energy through a system acts to organize that system. The flow of energy through a system acts to organize that system. Dominance and submission is the flow of energy through a system. And it could be economic energy, it could be information energy, it could be physical energy, it could be whatever, all kinds of things. Now, the question is, what direction does influence flow? When we talk about leadership, just means influence. Influence literally is inflow, inflow. Where's stuff flowing in from? And so if you look at any corporation or organization or society, there is a direction of flow. Where are physical resources flowing? Where's the money flowing? If you want to understand politics, you need to understand where the money's flowing. Whose values define what's good or bad, right? Who says whether that's a good slide I just did or bad slide? That's a value judgment. Beliefs, behavior, all of these are different aspects of influence. Now, I find this video very powerful. Maybe some of you guys have seen this, but this is an example of an alpha baboon protecting his. Now, let me start this over because what I want you to notice is when there's a leopard that's going to attack this group of baboons. And now notice that everybody is running away. And then this one dude is running towards the danger. Everybody else is running away from the danger. This dude is running towards the danger. Pretty intense. And so he puts himself directly in the way of this leopard that's coming to attack the pack. And he's got a few of his lieutenants here that said backing him up. It's just this vicious brawl. Right? And it ends with all of them chasing the leopard away, right? So the leopard starts, they're all running away. And then by the end, because of this leader jumping in and being brave, right? In the end, the leopard is running the other direction. So I've watched that video a lot of times. You might want to watch it a few times as well. Let me show one more time. Everybody thinks it's like really cool to be the leader, the CEO, the president, whatever. And everybody thinks they would do a better job than the president. The essence of democracy is you get 400 million Americans all thinking they could do a better job than the president, right? And so giving an opinion. But basically, this guy, this is not a fun job. He's not actually having a great time. That is what you call a very rough day. And it's not easy being in a leadership position because by definition, as a leader, you are exposed, right? You're putting yourself at risk. You're putting yourself a bit vulnerable to protect the group. And this is really the essence of leadership, is out of compassion, wishing to protect others, especially from fear. I want to defend a little bit my use of and my reference to these terms dominance and submission because the terms became a little bit tainted. Originally, these are terms from sociology, and then in the 80s, it started getting tainted by this sort of kinky stuff. But you have these DISC personality assessments, and these talk about your personality type, including these characteristics like how dominant is your personality. So this is highly regarded, highly recognized. Another aspect of this is situational leadership. It's one leadership training program called Situational Leadership. And there are two axes, supportive behavior and directive behavior. And this supportive and directive are a euphemism for submissive and dominant. So are you letting people do stuff, or are you telling people what to do? And this is Ken Blanchard, prominent leadership theorist. He summarized his decades of experience in leadership training with this one diagram, that sometimes as a leader, you need more directive behavior. And sometimes as a leader, you need more submissive, supportive, listening, learning behavior. And you need the wisdom and the flexibility to balance all of those together. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but we can think there are six. Why do people enter into these kinds of relationships with each other? It's all based on six different kinds of cravings. If we're on the outside of a group, we may be craving pity. And so sometimes within a corporation, you have people asking, telling about how hard their life is and whining and so forth. What we're doing when we're whining is we're craving pity. And sometimes it really does indicate something's unfair and problematic, and sometimes it's just a bit of laziness. Often craving inclusion, and this is what breeds conformity, the tendency to just conform. And sometimes we're craving impact. If you're close to the center of an organization, you want to have more impact. Leadership often involves breaking out from the pack, right? Breaking out from a group to be independent, right? And overcoming your craving for inclusion and overcoming your craving for pity and being strong to try to make an impact, a leader carving off, doing their own thing. Now, there's three other qualities. Typically, we're either craving to be seen as strong, or seen as intelligent, or seen as attractive, right? And you can make sense of basically all human behavior as at any given moment, we're primarily guided by one of these kinds of cravings. I feel like maybe I'd have to explain that a little bit more. But if you think about an org chart, you remember this quote, the flow of energy through a system functions to organize that system. An org chart represents the flow of energy through the system. Power, who makes decisions and why, and where the information flows. Now you think about data cables and power cables. In an old school organization where there's only one person in charge, this person's name is David Power. It's a fictional person, but they've given him this name, David Power, as like a in an old school organization, nobody else is thinking. Only David Power here is doing the thinking. He's thinking for everybody, telling everybody what to do, right? And it's just all this power going out and information. Now, modern organizations they're in much more complex environments, right? So we need a bidirectional flow of information, right? And you need a sensitivity. You need to be pushing intelligence to the edges of the organization. And you don't want the central people to be overpowering, because what happens is you trigger this fear response. And in general, to the degree that there is an atmosphere of fear within an organization, you will not get people being honest. You will not get real flow of information. And so the key skill of a leader is to be dominant enough to hold your ground, to have clarity on what needs to be done, but to be submissive or supportive enough to listen to everybody, to think deeply, to not have your ego be guiding everything. And so there's a real sort of subtlety and nuance. And the last point I want to share is that in any organization, I told you we've got these bits we're made of, our feelings, thoughts, actions. Our thoughts, our feelings, our actions are what really define us and create us as an individual. And other people also have their thoughts, their feelings, their actions, create them. And what we're doing when we're working together as groups is we're beginning to establish shared view, shared understanding, shared values, feelings, goals, and shared behaviors. And in that way, creating some shared sense of identity and going from being just acting as individuals to acting as larger groups, as a superorganism from a biology point of view. So again, I'll end here with this point that leadership just means influence. And hopefully you've got some better sense for what that means and what it means for things to flow in. So I wanted to invite a chance to discuss and to do breakout groups here. I know we've got a few folks here. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up some breakout groups, and really delighted that you all have been able to join. I'm going to put you in groups of two, and I just want to we're going to do an exercise called 1, 2 for all. And what that means is I'm just going to give you 1 minute on your own to think about what about this influence. Like in what ways have you seen influence be used in a helpful way? We'll take that as the first topic. Where have you seen helpful influence or helpful leadership in your organizations in the past? Or what are the most helpful kinds of influences you've seen? So I'll give you just 1 minute to contemplate that, and I'll put you in breakout groups then for a couple of minutes just to share, and then we'll go into larger groups after that. So I'm going to set a timer just for 1 minute. Where have you seen influence be helpful, creating a healthy organizational culture? Now I'm going to open up breakout groups in groups of two and just share, first of all, give you a few minutes and just introduce yourself very briefly and then share what examples come to mind in terms of beneficial influence in the organization. All right. So does anybody want to share examples that came to mind of beneficial?
I think a big thing that comes to mind for me when a leader being influential in the culture is one thing that I always see is that culture is sometimes something that can't be delegated, right? You'd like to believe that your organization is going to build its own culture and you don't necessarily want to tip the scale in one way or another. You want to have it develop. But in certain tactical ways, I think a leader has to both set the tone by how they act and also sometimes deliberately get involved. And one issue I think that has a lot of ramifications across everything else, and this is maybe more of an American issue than a European one, is paid time off, right? Because you have cultures where leaders are make themselves available to their leadership or everybody 24/7, they never shut down, and then the people below them feel pressured to do the same thing. So I feel like a leader who demonstrates that they can set a proper boundaries, it develops a safety for the people in their organization to also set proper boundaries. But even sometimes that's not enough, right? Like I've seen organizations where you have a lot of high achieving individual contributors and they don't want to take time off because they're working on some important initiative and then it's the next important initiative. And all of a sudden you get to the end of the year and they haven't taken any time off. And I think it's important to do that. So I think a leader, especially a person with direct reports, needs to, at the very minimum, be mindful of of time off and both I've seen it monitored to the excess, but also to the minimum because you need to make sure your people are taking time off and we don't get to the end of the year. It's, oh, you didn't take any time off. Go away for a month now. And not only does that not help the organization, but that's not really the point of having PTO. Like you need that time away periodically, not just in one big lump once a year. So yeah, that was really the big thing that came to mind for me.
Great example.
I have a little bit more of a cynical view, I think, especially given being in marketing and so close to sales. When we think about how you were saying that things are organized by the energy that flows through it, the energy that flows through a lot of these companies at this side and this level is money. And that organizes things for the worse. And so you have to have leadership that can be protective of people from that sad but very real truth. And not all leaders want to do that because they want to be close to that energy because that energy is power. So I don't know. That's my only thought on that. There's no punctuation to that, just a kind of a cynical thought.
Cynical thoughts, very welcome. Thank you. I think I'm with Hilda. I'm nodding a lot as well, that the economic energy is huge and massively influential in terms of what an organization really values, right? And we talk about, Christopher was saying you can't delegate culture if you're a leader. That's a very strong statement to say that as a leader, you're actually responsible for creating a culture. That's a big responsibility. And when you talk about company values versus the value of money, there really is a tension, or can definitely be a tension between those. And you find out what the company's real values are when there's a tension between values. That's when you know what the real value is. Okay. I think what we've got is, well, so money is, Courtney described it as a sad, Luke said it's almost always money, and Courtney described it as a sad truth. I would go back to that slide where we do have a physical body, right? There is some physical body that needs to be housed in some physical space and needs some food and so forth. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there is some basic level of survival to pay everybody's salaries and so forth. But the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that you need to take care of the basic survival and safety and security needs, and then transcend those increasingly. And I believe the same thing applies to companies, right? Companies need to be financially self-sustaining, but exist for a real meaningful purpose. So I think we've got time for another round of the breakout sessions. And I really feel like these breakout sessions are where people learn more. You connect with each other and then also learn richly. So I want to invite you to take another minute, but here Courtney's primed us for it. But where do you see unhealthy examples of influence? Where does the influence that people have on a company have an unhealthy effect? Maybe you can think of some stories around that. So I'll give you a minute or so to just contemplate, and I'm going to create new breakout groups to invite you to then share those ideas. Any insights or thoughts on or examples of unhealthy ways that influence manifests in organizations?
I can share one of the observations from our group. So one of the things we talked about was if you have a really toxic personality in a leadership position, so, someone who's leading largely by fear, making irrational choices very loudly and pushing that down on the rest of the organization, specifically on their organization, and then all the organizations that they touch around them. That destructive energy is so powerful that you can ruin a culture that took 10 years to build in 6 months when you have somebody in a position of power who is acting that way. And then we did talk too a little bit about when that happens, a lot of times the C-level team will try to rehabilitate that leader and get them to act right and not be thinking about, while this leader is coming up to speed on how to behave like a functioning adult, that the damage is still happening around them. And you're creating this huge mess to clean up that maybe is going to take you another 10 years to clean up, even if you are able to help grow this leader. So having healthy leaders from day one instead of day 90, I think is really important.
Thank you. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about cover your ass leadership. So people who kind of want to impress the people above them versus acting as if they're the lieutenants that we saw in the monkey video. And then you create that ivory tower, that protected class of leadership that's willing to sell out their entire department or the people below them that they're supposed to be protecting and nurturing and supporting. And then it causes it causes the bottom of the pyramid to be expendable in a way that sets the company back in a lot of ways, because if you're letting people go and onboarding new people and keeping this protected class, you continue to erode the ground that your company stands on.
Yeah, I echo with what Courtney and Kristen said actually. So Kristen said about having a good leadership from the starting of day 1 versus day 90. I have a very good ongoing example that when I started with my current team, it was like a very good team because the leadership was very good. And slowly the leadership changed and things started moving in the opposite direction, and lots of people started leaving, and the leaders are not bothered about people leaving. They are like, okay, we'll build the new team. We are okay with onboarding new members, and they are not okay with keeping the other folks, and if they are leaving, they are giving some other reason or being ignorant about those reasons, that why are people leaving. So I can totally relate to what everyone is talking about with the bad leadership or a not so influential leadership when you have in the hierarchy. The whole thing or the whole team breaks down. It's just that as a team, we can keep each other in a good environment or promote a healthy environment. But at the end of the day, the leaders that we are working with, they don't really bothered about, they're not much bothered about helping you grow. Instead, they are just more focused on pleasing their managers and their leadership. Yeah.
One thing that's coming to mind hearing these stories is it's very easy to feel like the leaders are good or bad, right? Good leaders, bad leaders, and so forth. It's very important as we're training our own leadership ability to try to empathize with those leaders, good leaders and bad leaders, to try to get a better sense of what's going on for them, what's happening in their mind that's making them act in a certain way or not act in a certain way. So when I'm thinking about Ishita's example, and the leaders are seeing people leave, presumably they maybe are not thinking, maybe it's something that I'm doing that's causing them to leave. Or maybe they are, but it's a very uncomfortable thought, right? Is there something wrong with me that's making people leave? Or in Courtney's example, if the leaders are selling out their whole department and just trying to cover their butts, right? What's happening in their minds? What's their emotional state that makes them so afraid of losing their job that they're happy to sacrifice their team for that? I think it's very important. There's not a perfect answer to these questions, but I think it's very important for us to try to occupy the emotional state of these leaders, or Kristen's leader, the sort of bullying, threatening one. We need to figure out what's going on for these people so that when we see that stuff happening in our heart, right, we don't recreate the same patterns. Because it's very easy to say when it's somebody else, they should do things differently. And then when you're in that situation, it's very difficult to say, maybe I'm going to be willing to sacrifice my own job instead of covering my butt. I'm willing to sacrifice my job to protect my team, for example. That's a big step. Okay, so Kristen, I just want to, do you want to read your comment, Kristen? Or I can read it, but
Yeah, I can read it. So I think what you're talking about has a lot to do with situational awareness from leadership to their teams. And I've been in situations managing small teams where I don't always share all of that information because it would be a huge distraction or emotional mental burden for them to carry that distracts them from their work. And so they might see me acting out in ways that don't make sense to them because they don't have all the information, but I'm not sure in all cases that's information I would want to share. So how do we deal with if that's the reason for what's perceived as poor behavior? So if I as a leader know that I'm going to have to reduce headcount, that layoffs are coming, that's information that may cause me to act in ways that don't make sense to the people that aren't aware that layoffs are coming. But maybe that's not information that I necessarily want to share because I'm very worried that it's going to cause more panic and do more harm to the organization than good if everyone knew.
So that would be an example where the leader has some fear that they need to hold private and not share with their team. And I think you were also implying that there may be cases where the leader would have fears or concerns that they would share with the team.
Yeah.
And that having the wisdom to determine which is appropriate.
And I had the opposite problem at a previous employer. I got hired, and 2 months later, they did like a 15% reduction in force. And for the entire time I was there was always the threat overhead looming of having to cut more people. And there were a couple instances where everyone pretty much agreed that they had cut too many from our particular group because we were We were IT, we were a cost center, so they tried to strip that down and that they cut too far. And there were a couple instances where they had gotten some additional headcount approved to re-expand some teams or get some new roles. And 4 different times those roles were canceled without hiring anybody. And we were supposed to feel grateful for that because hey, we didn't have to let anybody go. We just canceled the new headcount. We're going to get it. So meanwhile, we're all underwater because there's not enough heads to do the work. But I mean, so we had a lot of, I guess the point there is we have a lot of visibility into at least what leadership is thinking, or theoretically we did. But that was a constant point of stress and tension in that, hey, like we're underwater, but I feel like I can't ask for help because we should feel lucky that we have our jobs as it is.
And so one of my takeaways from all of this discussion is that it's a very emotional thing, right? Like humans interacting with other humans, there's always emotions involved. Literally, you cannot make any decision. We never make decisions without emotions being involved. Emotions are continuously influencing every organization, and we influence each other. And that's a big part of the social influencing is the emotional contagion and spread, which means as leaders, we have to become very clear and aware of what's going on inside of ourselves and illuminate this inner world and learn how to skillfully manage our fear and emotion so that we're not acting in ways so that we're providing the necessary role of support, protection, including keeping our own mind peaceful and protected. Really, just closing out here, I am super grateful for everybody joining this webinar. One of the reasons I did this is to let folks know that we are gathering in San Diego in a couple of months' time. I've still got some seats. We've got Chris and Kristen and Luke are all joining us for the event. And we've had more seats available. So if you or anybody you know is interested in joining us, we'd be delighted. I had thought that today I would have the benefit of Olivier Hug, my co-facilitator for the retreat, being here, but he turned out to not be available. But anyway, so delighted to host folks together in person. And one of the things we'll be doing in person is just interaction games, physical interactions with each other as humans in real 3D space, which is something you just can't recreate on Zoom. Final point, go forth and lead. May you have all of the confidence, fearlessness, and peace that you need to be wonderful leaders in your own world, in your own space, personal and professional. And delighted to be here with everybody and happy to hang out if there's other questions or thoughts anybody wants to share. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andrew.